Her father hated and sold her over a broken vase, until the Alpha King marked her as his mate. The castle of King Malric stood on the edge of the northern cliffs, a dark silhouette against the dying sun. Its tall towers pierced the sky like cold, silent sentinels, and its walls were as unyielding as the man who ruled within. Leora, the king's only daughter, walked along the echoing corridors, her small hands clutching a delicate porcelain vase she had been tasked to clean, painted with golden flowers that seemed to glow in the candlelight. "Careful, child," her maid whispered, following her with cautious steps. "One slip, and it will be gone forever." Leora nodded, her heart beating with a mix of pride and anxiety.
She had always been careful, always attentive, because she knew her father's patience was thinner than the porcelain she held.
Desk. King Malric had little love for his daughter. To him, she was a distraction, a fragile mistake in a line of plans he considered far more important than her happiness. As she reached the pedestal, her fingers trembled. She had just set the vase down when a slight misstep caused it to wobble. In the instant it tipped, time seemed to slow. Leora lunged to catch it, but her fingertips brushed the cold porcelain too late. The vase fell, shattering into tiny pieces that scattered across the marble floor. The sound of it breaking was like a thunderclap in the hall. Leora froze, her breath catching. Her maid gasped, clutching her chest. Pain. And then came the echo she had always feared. Her father's footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming down the stairs. "You've broken it," King Malric said, his voice cold and sharp. Dark eyes scanned the fragments, and then he looked at Leora, his lips pressed into a thin, unforgiving line. "Do you understand what this means?" I'm sorry, Father," Leora whispered, her voice shaking. It was an accident." "I didn't mean—" Silence. His voice cut through the hall like a blade. "You are careless, weak."
Perspect.
You cannot even guard a simple vase. Perhaps. His gaze darkened, calculating.
"Perhaps you are better off elsewhere."
Yes!
Elsewhere. She had heard whispers, of course, of daughters being sent away, married off for wealth, alliances, or convenience. But never had she imagined that her father would consider her so disposable. Within hours, arrangements were made. A neighboring lord, one greedy for land and prestige, would take her as his ward, or perhaps his bride. Her future was no longer hers to decide. Leora was stunned, the weight of betrayal pressing on her chest like a stone. Her father did not even look at her as he signed the papers, his mind already turning to his next schemes. The day she was to leave, Leora packed her meager belongings with trembling hands. Her maid tried to console her, but words felt empty. Leora's heart ached with a sense of loss she could not name. She had loved her home, flawed as it was. She had trusted her father, as a child trusts the hand that feeds and guides it. But that trust was gone, broken as surely as the vase she had dropped. The carriage that would take her away was a heavy, blackened thing, drawn by horses that pawed the ground nervously. Leora climbed in, her hands pressed to the seat, her eyes fixed on the distance. Behind her, the castle faded into a dark silhouette against the horizon. As the carriage rumbled through the countryside, the wind began to rise. Storm clouds gathered like dark armies over the mountains. Leora pressed her face against the glass, watching lightning strike in the distance, illuminating the jagged peaks. There was a strange beauty in the storm, wild and dangerous, yet she could not help but feel it mirrored the turmoil inside her. Hours passed. The road twisted through forests and valleys, and the sky darkened further until the first drops of rain began to fall. The storm grew heavier, rain lashing against the carriage with ferocity. The horses stumbled, hooves slipping on the slick road. Leora's heart raced, fear gripping her like icy fingers. Suddenly, a massive branch, loosened by the wind, fell across the path. The driver could not stop in time. Desk. The carriage crashed violently, wheels breaking, horses panicking. Leora was thrown to the floor, her head striking the wood. Pain flared, and then darkness threatened to take her. When she opened her eyes, she found herself in the midst of a dark forest. The storm raged around her, but in the shadow of the tree she saw a figure standing tall and unmoved. The man was massive, with eyes like molten gold, and a presence that seemed to command the wind and rain itself. His hair was black as the night, his armor glinting with an otherworldly sheen. "You shouldn't be here," Leora whispered, more to herself than to him. "You are here," the man said, his voice deep and resonant, carrying over the storm as if it spoke directly to her soul. "And now you belong to me, Desk." His words were not a threat, but a declaration. She stared at him, fear and confusion warring inside her. "I don't belong to anyone," she said, trying to stand, but her legs shook beneath her. The man stepped closer, and the storm seemed to bow around him, the winds twisting as if in obedience. "You do now," he said. He raised his hand, and a soft light glowed around her wrist. Leora felt a warmth that spread through her chest, powerful and strange. A mark appeared on her skin, intricate and glowing faintly, binding her in a way she could not comprehend. What is this?" she asked, trembling. "It is the mark of fate," he said. "The Alpha has claimed you. You are mine, body, soul, and destiny." The words should have terrified her, and yet there was something in his presence, something ancient and commanding that made her pulse quicken despite herself. She wanted to resist, wanted to run, but the strength to do so seemed to vanish in his gaze. "You cannot fight it," he said, noticing the conflict in her eyes. "Nor should you." "In time you will understand." Leora's mind raced. She did not know who this man was, or why he had appeared at the exact moment of her greatest despair. Path. All she knew was that she was alone, abandoned by her father, and now claimed by a stranger with power beyond comprehension. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He bent slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "Because you are the one who can survive what is coming. Because you are strong, even if you do not see it yet. And because some bonds are chosen by fate, not by consent." The storm around them intensified, the forest seeming alive with unseen eyes and restless shadows. Leora shivered, her body tense with fear and wonder. The mark on her wrist pulsed softly, a rhythm that matched the beating of her heart. Desk. She wanted to cry, to scream, to throw herself into the wild night and be done with it. But instead, she stayed, drawn by a force she could not name. The Alpha King, this mysterious and terrible man, had appeared at the very edge of her despair, and now, against her will, she was bound to him. Hours seemed to pass in silence, the storm finally beginning to abate. The Alpha King finally spoke again. "You will come with me," he said simply. "Tonight you are mine, but in time you will understand your power and your place." Leora felt a mixture of fear and defiance rise within her. She did not yet understand what this man wanted, what the mark meant, or what the future held. All she knew was that her life had changed forever, that the castle and her father were behind her, and that something ancient and terrible now watched over her. As she followed him through the darkened forest, Her mind swirled with thoughts of betrayal, fear, and a strange curiosity. Who was this man? Why had he come for her? And most importantly, death. What would happen if she refused to submit? The Alpha King did not answer, but his presence was enough. The forest seemed to bend around them, the shadows alive, whispering secrets in the wind. Leora knew, deep in her bones, that nothing would ever be the same. She had been sold, abandoned, and yet, in the strangest twist of fate, she had been chosen. And somewhere, deep within her, a small spark of hope flickered. Perhaps, she thought, this storm, both literal and within her heart, was the beginning of something she could never have imagined. The night closed around them like a velvet shroud, and Leora felt the first real fear she had ever known, not of death, but of the life that awaited her with the Alpha King, and the power that now pulsed within her veins. The mark glowed faintly in the dark, a promise and a warning. And as she walked beside the stranger who had claimed her, Leora could not help but feel that her destiny, so cruelly torn from her by her father, was only beginning to unfold. And somewhere, far away, the broken vase lay in pieces, forgotten by all but the daughter who had survived its fall. The Alpha King's fortress rose from the northern cliffs like a crown of stone and shadow. Its walls were dark, carved from the black rock of the mountains, and towers pierced the clouds like daggers. The wind screamed through the ramparts, carrying the scent of pine and snow, as if warning all who approached that this was a place ruled by power beyond mortal understanding. Leora followed KL through the winding corridors, her heart heavy with confusion and fear. Every step echoed off the stone walls, a reminder that she was no longer in the familiar halls of her father's castle. Here, there was no comfort, no gentle voice, no warmth that reminded her of safety. She was alone with the Alpha King, the man who had marked her, claimed her, and now walked beside her as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Kale moved silently, his golden eyes fixed ahead. His presence was overwhelming, commanding the shadows around him. Leora could feel it, even when he said nothing. The weight of his power, the strength that radiated from him like heat from a forge. It made her want to shrink back, yet some part of her, deep and unspoken, stirred with a strange fascination.
"You'll eat, sleep, and live here," Kale said finally, his voice low and steady.
This is your new home. You will follow my rules. Leora began, but her voice faltered. There was something in his gaze that made her hesitate, something both frightening and magnetic. I don't understand. Why me? Why now? KL stopped and looked at her, the storm of the previous night still lingering in his eyes. Because you were abandoned. Because your father chose greed over love. And because the bond between us, it is not broken by fear or resistance. Leora swallowed hard, feeling the pulse of the mark on her wrist. The glow was faint now, but it pulsed with a rhythm that seemed to match her heartbeat. She had tried to resist, tried to push back against the invisible chains he had set around her fate, but each attempt had only made the connection stronger. The fortress was vast and cold, but not empty. Shadows moved along the walls as though alive, and distant howls echoed from the peaks beyond. Leora felt the hairs on her arms rise. The place seemed alive, as if it breathed and watched, and she realized that this was not just Kale's home. It was an extension of him, a fortress shaped by his power and presence. You must understand something, Kale said as he led her to a small chamber. You are not a guest. You are mine, but that does not mean you are powerless. Dest, in time, you will learn to control the magic that has awakened within you.
Magic? Leora echoed, fear and curiosity mingling.
What magic? Kale studied her silently, and then, with a faint motion of his hand, the glow of the mark spread slightly along her arm. Leora felt a surge of warmth, like sunlight through ice, and a strange energy coursed through her. She stumbled back, gripping the edge of a stone table.
You are descended from those who could command the old powers, Kale said.
Bad blood flows in you. The mark did not just claim you, it awakened you. And soon, the world will see what you are capable of. Leora's mind swirled. Bay. All her life she had felt small, powerless, trapped by her father's cruelty. And now, in the shadow of this powerful man, she felt something she had never felt before. Potential. A fire that refused to be extinguished. Yet, even as the energy within her grew, so did her fear of Kale. He was relentless, unyielding, and yet, sometimes, when his gaze softened, she glimpsed a man burdened by loneliness, haunted by a past he rarely spoke of. It was confusing, frustrating, and impossible to understand. Days passed. Leora's routine was strict and demanding. She trained under Kale's watchful eye, learning to channel the energy that now lived inside her. At first, it was frightening. Objects would tremble when she passed her hand over them. Shadows would shift at her approach. Sometimes in moments of anger or fear, the mark glowed bright enough to light the dark corridors. Kale observed her closely, correcting her movements, guiding her through exercises that tested not only her strength but her mind and will. Leora's frustration grew with each failure, but so did her respect for him. He was merciless, yet patient when she needed it, harsh, yet protective in ways she could not explain. "You are not weak," he said one evening, as they sparred in a large hall lit by torches. "You are not the frightened child your father thinks you are. You are stronger than you know. But strength without control is dangerous." "I don't even understand what I am," Leora shouted, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "Why me? Why did you choose me?" Kale's expression softened for the briefest moment. "Because even the strongest warriors need a companion. Even the fiercest kings need someone to challenge them, to anchor them." The words struck her like lightning. Leora felt her cheeks burn. A strange warmth she did not understand. She wanted to protest, wanted to turn away, yet the intensity of his gaze held her in place. There was a tension between them, unspoken but undeniable, a pull neither could fully explain. Night after night, Leora struggled with the bond. The mark pulsed, sometimes warm, sometimes hot, and she felt as though it carried not just power but emotion, thoughts she could not understand. She had grown up thinking love was gentle, safe, and simple. This bond was none of those things. It was dangerous, consuming, and yet, in some twisted way, comforting. One night, as the northern lights shimmered across the sky, Kale approached her chamber. "You should rest," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Tomorrow will be harder." "You must be ready. I don't know if I can," Leora admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I want to be ready."
Kale knelt before her, not touching her, but his presence seemed to fill the room. "You are stronger than you think," he said.
"Stronger than your father. Stronger than your doubts. And I will not let anyone take you from this place. Not him. Not anyone." The promise was comforting, yet frightening. Leora realized then that the man before her was not just her captor, not just her master. He was something more. Someone who could protect her, yet demand everything from her in return. The days turned into weeks. Leora's skills grew, her control over the magic within her improving steadily. while she learned to summon light and darkness, to shape shadows, and even to sense the presence of those who approached her. Each small victory brought pride, but also fear, for she knew that power always came with a price. Cale remained an enigma, alternating between strict teacher and distant guardian. There were moments when she saw him laugh softly, or when his expression betrayed a pain she could not name. In those moments, Leora felt a strange empathy, a connection that went beyond fear or obligation. She began to wonder if this bond, forced as it was, might also hold something else: trust, respect, maybe even something closer to affection. One evening, a messenger arrived from the northern lands. The letter he carried was sealed with a crest Leora did not recognize. Cale opened it quickly, scanning the words, his expression darkening. "They are moving," he said, his voice low and tense. "Enemies. They seek to claim you and the power within you." Fear surged through Leora. Enemies? Who?
Kyle did not answer immediately.
He merely gestured for her to follow. "You will need all your strength. Tomorrow we prepare. Tonight, you rest, for the trials ahead will test more than your skill. They will test your heart." Leora's mind raced as she lay in her chamber that night. She thought of her father who had sold her without a second thought, of the broken vase, a symbol of a life dismissed as unworthy, and of Cale, who had appeared like a storm and taken her fate into his hands. She was no longer the frightened child of her father's castle. She was becoming something new, a force to be reckoned with. And yet the thought of the trials ahead filled her with both excitement and terror. As the northern lights danced across the sky, the mark on her wrist pulsed gently, as if sensing her resolve. Leora closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She would not run. She would not cower. She would face whatever came next. And she would face it beside the Alpha King who had claimed her, bound her, and awakened the power that had always lived within her. But deep within the fortress, shadows whispered of dangers yet unseen. Allies might betray, enemies might strike, and the bond between Cale and Leora, so fragile, so intense, would be tested in ways neither could imagine. The night closed in, carrying with it the promise of storms, trials, and a bond that neither could escape. Leora knew, with a certainty she could not name, that her life had changed forever, and that the next dawn would bring the first true test of her strength, her courage, and her heart. Dawn broke over the northern cliffs with a cold, silvery light. The fortress of the Alpha King, which had seemed so still and eternal in the night, now glimmered faintly under the first rays. Leora stood at the edge of the terrace, her cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders, staring at the mountains and valleys that stretched endlessly before her. The mark on her wrist pulsed softly, as if echoing the rhythm of her own heartbeat. It had become part of her now, a reminder of the storm that had brought her here, of the Alpha King who had claimed her, and of the power that had begun to awaken within her. She had trained hard under Cale's watchful eye, and in the weeks since she had arrived at the fortress, she had grown stronger. The shadows no longer frightened her. She could sense them, bend them, and even shape them when she focused. Yet despite her growing power, a quiet unease lingered. The message from the northern lands had not left her mind.
Enemies were moving.
They would come for her. And Cale. Cale appeared silently behind her, his cloak brushing the stone floor. His presence was commanding, yet there was a gentleness in the way he spoke.
Early again,
He said, his golden eyes scanning the horizon.
you are eager, but the day will demand more than your curiosity. It will demand focus. I am ready,
Leora said, turning to meet his gaze. Whatever comes, I can face it. Kael's lips curved slightly, but his eyes were serious. Do not speak as if you are invincible. Power is dangerous, but so is pride. Remember that.
Eliara nodded, her fingers brushing the mark on her wrist. I won't forget.
Kael summoned the warriors of the northern clans, their armor gleaming even in the muted light. Leora observed closely, noting the way he moved, the way he commanded respect without raising his voice. There was a grace in his strength, a discipline that made her feel both awed and challenged. You are improving, Kael said quietly, noticing her gaze. But today, you will need more than skill. You will need courage, and you will need your heart. Leora swallowed hard. Courage was one thing, but heart was complicated. It was tied to fear, longing, anger, and hope. She thought of her father, of the betrayal that had brought her here, and of the strange bond that connected her to Kael.
The first sign of trouble came in the early afternoon.
A scout returned, breathless and muddy, eyes wide with alarm.
They are coming!
He gasped.
A band of warriors not far from the forest edge. They move swiftly, and they are many.
Kael's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. Prepare the defenses. Leora, you will come with me.
You must be ready to use your gift. Leora's pulse quickened.
She had trained for this, but nothing could fully prepare her for the moment when power collided with reality. Yet she felt a strange steadiness in her chest. The mark on her wrist pulsed with light, as if sensing her resolve. The warriors of the northern clans moved like shadows through the fortress. They took their positions silently, waiting for Kael's signal. Leora followed him to the central hall, where a large map of the region was spread across a stone table.
They will attempt to surround us,
Kael said, tracing a finger along the paths they were likely to take.
We cannot let them breach the outer walls. If they reach the inner fortress, we will lose the advantage.
Leora listened carefully, her mind absorbing every detail. She had always felt small and powerless in her father's castle, but here, she was learning strategy, control, and the weight of responsibility. The realization brought a mixture of pride and fear. Night fell, and with it came the sound of approaching boots, the rustle of armor, and the murmur of voices carried on the wind. Leora's heart pounded, but she did not falter. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the energy of the mark flow through her, focusing on the shadows that gathered in the corners of the hall. Kael placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and firm. Trust yourself, he whispered. Trust the bond. It will guide you. The first wave of attackers struck just as the moon rose. Leora felt the power inside her surge as she raised her hands. Shadows twisted and moved at her command, forming barriers that blocked the enemy's advance. She felt a thrill, the rush of energy mingling with fear, and for a moment she understood what Kael had meant. This power was part of her, and it could protect those she cared for. Kael moved beside her, swift and precise, striking down enemies with the grace of a predator.
Leora watched him, learning from every movement, every decision, every controlled burst of energy.
The battle was chaotic, but together they moved as one, two forces bound by destiny, strength, and the invisible threads of the mark. Despite their efforts, the enemy pressed forward, relentless in their attack. Leora felt herself grow weary, muscles straining, heart racing, and yet, when she looked at Kael, she saw no fear. Only determination, only the certainty that they would not fail. Desk. Then, from the shadows of the outer wall, a figure emerged. A man familiar yet feared. It was her father, King Malric, accompanied by a small band of warriors. His eyes were sharp, cruel, and filled with the same ambition that had abandoned her so long ago.
Leora,
He called, his voice carrying over the clash of battle.
Come back to me! You do not belong to him!
The anger she had buried for so long surged up. He never cared for me, she shouted, her voice echoing. He sold me for gold, for nothing more than a broken vase. Kael's hand rested on her shoulder again, grounding her. Do not waste your power on rage alone, he said. Focus, or they will overwhelm us. But Leora did not falter. The mark on her wrist flared brightly, its energy spilling out in a wave that knocked the enemy backward. Shadows rose from the ground, twisting and wrapping around those who had come for her, holding them in place. Her father's eyes widened in disbelief, and for the first time, Leora felt a strange satisfaction, not in hurting him, but in knowing she had grown beyond his control. The battle raged on, but with Leora and Kael working together, the fortress held. The enemy was forced to retreat, leaving the northern cliffs silent once more. Leora stood amidst the aftermath, her chest heaving, hands trembling, but her eyes shining with a newfound confidence. Kael approached her, his expression unreadable for a moment, then softened. You were magnificent, he said quietly. You faced your fears and used your power wisely. I am proud of you. Leora swallowed, the words touching something deep within her. I couldn't have done it without you, she admitted. Kael shook his head. But... You could have. You have always had the strength.
You just needed to see it. For a moment, silence passed between them.
Leora felt the weight of their bond, the mark on her wrist pulsing gently, connecting them in ways she was only beginning to understand. She realized that this bond was not just about power or fate. It was about trust, respect, and something far more complicated, a growing connection that neither could deny. Days passed after the battle, and the fortress settled into a tense calm. Leora spent time training, learning more about her powers, and growing closer to Kael in ways that were quiet but meaningful. They sparred, strategized, and even shared moments of laughter, a sound that had seemed impossible in the shadowed halls of the fortress before. Yet the threat of her father remained. King Malric's greed and ambition had not been defeated. Leora knew he would try again, and she also knew that the next time, the stakes would be higher. One evening she found herself alone on the terrace, staring at the moon reflecting off the distant peaks. The wind whispered through her hair, carrying with it a sense of both freedom and danger. She traced the mark on her wrist, feeling its steady warmth. It was a reminder of the journey she had taken, from a frightened, powerless girl to someone who could command shadows and light. Kael joined her silently, standing just behind her. The next challenge will test more than your strength, he said. It will test your heart. Leora turned to look at him, curiosity and uncertainty mingling in her gaze. My heart? Yes, he said softly. The bond between us is more than power. It is connection, trust, and choice.
You must decide what you are willing to fight for and whom you are willing to trust. Her chest tightened.
She had trusted Kael, yet the bond was complex, filled with tension, longing, and unspoken feelings. She realized that courage was not just about wielding power. It was about opening herself to the unknown, to the possibility of connection, and to the vulnerability that came with it. As the moon rose higher, Leora felt a quiet determination settle within her. She would face her father again, face the enemies that threatened her, and face the truth of her bond with Kael. She was no longer the powerless girl who had been sold for a broken vase. She was a force in her own right, bound by destiny, choice, and a power that had always been waiting inside her. And as the wind swept through the fortress, carrying whispers of storms and shadows yet to come, Leora understood that her journey was only beginning. The battle had been won, but the tides of redemption, trust, and power were still rising. She would face them, not as a pawn, but as a queen of her own making, standing beside the Alpha King who had marked her as his mate, and perhaps, in time, her heart. The night deepened, carrying both promise and challenge. The bond between Leora and Cale was no longer just fate. It was choice, strength, and the quiet beginning of something neither of them fully understood. Somewhere in the shadows, the northern lands whispered of the trials yet to come, of loyalties tested and hearts challenged.
Leora felt it in the pulse of the mark on her wrist, in the tension in the air, and in the steady gaze of the man beside her.
She was ready, and the next dawn would prove it. The northern wind howled through the fortress, carrying the scent of snow and distant smoke. Leora stood at the edge of the terrace, her cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. The forces of her father, King Malric, were moving closer, their banners flickering like shadows in the dim light. She felt the mark on her wrist pulse strongly, as if warning her that the final test of her power and her heart was near. Cale appeared silently behind her, his golden eyes scanning the valleys below. The Alpha King's presence was like gravity itself, firm and unyielding, and yet somehow comforting in its certainty. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and grounding, a silent promise that they would face what was coming together. "You are ready," he said at last, his voice low and calm. "But readiness is not just about strength. Desperate heart, episode, abrupt caught." He glances around in a hard choice, and the courage to face what you fear most. Over the past weeks, she had grown in skill, control, and understanding. The magic within her no longer frightened her. She could command it, shape it, and bend it to her will. Yet she knew that her father's betrayal, his ambition, and the enemies he commanded would challenge more than her magic. They would test her very spirit. The fortress gates were open just as dawn began to break, and the northern army moved forward in waves, their armor catching the first pale rays of sunlight. Leora felt a mixture of fear and determination, but she refused to falter. She had survived betrayal, abandonment, and despair. She would survive this. Kyle led her to the central hall where the warriors of the northern clans were assembled. Their faces were grim but determined, their eyes reflecting respect and trust in the Alpha King, and, quietly, in Leora.
"You will stand beside me," Cale said. "The bond we share is not just a mark."
Desk. It is connection, trust, and strength. Today, you fight not only for yourself, but for those who believe in you. Bah. Remember that. Leora inhaled deeply, feeling the energy of the mark spread through her body. She lifted her hands, shadows twisting and coiling at her command. Light and dark danced together in her palms, a force of nature shaped by her will. The first wave of her father's army hit the outer walls, and Leora was ready. Shadows rose, forming barriers that blocked the attackers' advance. Soldiers stumbled against the unseen walls, while others retreated in confusion. Leora felt exhilaration pulse through her as the magic responded to her thoughts, obeying her without hesitation. She had never felt so alive. Cale moved beside her, precise and unstoppable. His strikes were swift, almost artistic, as he pushed back the enemy lines. Vondenar.
Leora followed his lead, learning from every move, every shift, every controlled burst of energy. They moved as one.
Two forces bound not just by the mark but by trust, respect, and an unspoken connection that had grown stronger with each trial. Then, from the shadowed tree line, a voice rang out cold and familiar.
Leora! King Malric's shout carried over the clash of battle. "You belong to me!"
Come back. Leora froze for a brief moment, anger surging like a storm. She thought of the years he had neglected her, of the vase broken so long ago, of the countless ways he had chosen greed over love. Her hurt burned, not with vengeance, but with clarity. She would no longer be his pawn. The mark on her wrist flared brightly, and shadows surged forward, forcing the enemy army back.
Leora lifted her head, meeting her father's gaze for the first time in years.
"I belong to myself," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Not you.
Not anyone. I choose who I am and who I fight for."
Kale placed a hand on her shoulder again, steadying her.
"Well said," he murmured. "You have grown stronger than even I expected."
Her father faltered, shock and anger mingling in his eyes. He had underestimated the girl he had dismissed, sold, and abandoned. Leora's power, her courage, and the bond she shared with Kale were forces he could not comprehend. The final wave of the army approached, determined to breach the inner fortress. Leora took a deep breath, centering herself. Shadows rose from the ground at her command, forming walls, spears, and barriers that twisted around the attackers. Light burst from her hands, forming protective beams that cut through the chaos. Kale moved beside her, unstoppable and precise. Together they repelled the army, each move a blend of magic, skill, and trust. The battle raged for hours, and yet neither faltered. They had become a single force, stronger than any individual, bound by destiny and the bond of the mark. Finally, as the sun climbed higher, the northern army began to retreat. Leora stood at the terrace edge, her chest heaving, arms trembling, yet her eyes shone with triumph. Kale approached her slowly, his expression unreadable at first, then softening as he looked at her.
You were extraordinary, he said quietly.
You faced fear, power, and betrayal, and you chose yourself. That is true strength. Leora smiled faintly, feeling a warmth in her chest she could not name. I couldn't have done it without you, she admitted, her voice soft but firm. Kale shook his head gently. No. You could have.
I guided you, yes, but the power, the courage, it has always been yours. You just needed to believe it.
For a long moment they stood in silence, the wind tugging at their cloaks, shadows and light dancing across the terrace. The bond between them, forged in storms, battles, and trials, had transformed. Desk. It was no longer just fate or magic. It was trust, respect, and something deeper. Something neither had fully named. As the northern army retreated into the distance, Leora knew her father would not give up easily, but she also knew she was no longer powerless. She had faced betrayal, fear, and darkness, and emerged stronger, wiser, and ready. Kyle spoke again, his voice low and serious. Your father may return.
Others may come, but remember this. The mark binds us, yes, but it also protects.
Desprasp, you are not alone, Leora. You are never alone. She nodded, feeling the bond and the pulsing warmth of the mark on her wrist. Her heart, once uncertain and fearful, now held a quiet certainty. She would face whatever came next, standing not as a frightened girl sold for a broken vase, but as a force of her own making. Days passed, and the fortress settled into a tense calm. Leora continued to train, mastering the magic that pulsed within her. She learned to bend shadows to shield the fortress, to summon light to strike enemies, and to control the energy of the mark in ways that even Kale had not imagined. One evening, as the sun set in fiery hues over the cliffs, Kale took her to the terrace. "There is one final lesson," he said, his voice carrying both gravity and warmth. Strength is not just power. It is choice, heart, and courage. Today you have shown all three. Leora looked at him, her eyes reflecting the colors of the sunset. And what about the bond between us? She asked quietly. Is it only magic or something more?
Kale stepped closer, his presence steadying her.
It is magic, yes, he admitted. But it is also trust, respect, and the connection we choose to honor. That is the real strength of the bond. Leora felt the truth of his words in her chest. For the first time, she understood that the bond was not about submission, ownership, or fate alone. It was about choosing to stand together, to fight together, and to trust in each other's hearts. The wind whispered through the cliffs, carrying the promise of new beginnings. The mark on her wrist pulsed gently, steady and strong. Leora realized that she had grown beyond the girl who had been abandoned, betrayed, and sold. She was now a force, a queen of her own making, and she had found a companion who valued her not just for power but for the courage, heart, and spirit she had chosen to embrace. As night fell, the fortress glimmered under the stars. The northern lands were quiet once more, the threat of her father's armies driven back. Yet Leora knew that life would always bring challenges, tests, and shadows to face. But she was ready. She was no longer the fragile girl of the broken vase. She was Leora, bonded to Kale, strong in heart, mind, and spirit. And together they would face whatever storms came next. And somewhere in the quiet night the mark on her wrist pulsed softly, a reminder of the trials she had overcome, the strength she had claimed, and the bond she had chosen. The story of betrayal, power, and redemption had reached its first true ending. But Leora and Kale's journey, their connection, and the challenges of the northern lands would continue. The night was theirs, bound in shadow, trust, and the quiet promise of the future.